Chapter I. The Jews. Our earliest acquaintance with the human race discloses some sort of society established. It also reveals the existence of a marriage tie, varying in stringency and incidental effects according to climate, morals, religion, or accident, but everywhere essentially subversive of a system of promiscuous intercourse. No nation, it is believed, has ever been reported by a trustworthy traveler, on sufficient evidence, to have held its women generally in common. Still, there appear to have been in every age men who did not avail themselves of the marriage covenant, or who could not be bound by its stipulations, and their appetites created a demand for illegitimate pleasures, which female weakness supplied. This may be assumed to be the real origin of prostitution throughout the world, though in particular localities, this first cause has been assisted by female avarice or passion, religious superstition, or a mistaken sense of hospitality. Accordingly, prostitution is coeval with society. It stains the earliest mythological records. It is constantly assumed as an existing fact in biblical history. We can trace it from the earliest twilight in which history dawns to the clear daylight of today, without a pause or a moment of obscurity. Our most ancient historical record is believed to be the books of Moses. According to them, it must be admitted that prostitutes were common among the Jews in the 18th century before Christ. When Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah, desired to defeat the cruel Jewish custom, and to bear children, notwithstanding her widowhood, she put her widow's garments off from her, and covered her with a veil and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place. When Judah saw her, he thought her a harlot, for she had covered her face. The Genesaical account thus shows that prostitutes with covered faces must have been common at the time. It is the more valuable as it furnishes the particulars of the transaction. To keep up her disguise, Tamar demands a kid as her recompense. Judah agrees, and leaves his signet and his bracelets and his staff as a pledge for the kid. It appears to have been regarded as no dishonor to have commerce with a prostitute, for Judah sends his friend the Adullamite, a man of standing, to deliver the kid. But to defraud the unfortunate woman of her ill-gotten gain must have been considered shameful, for, when Judah learns that she has disappeared, he expresses alarm lest we be shamed for not having paid the stipulated price. It may also be noticed, as an illustration of the connection between prostitution and pure domestic morals, that when Judah learns that his daughter-in-law is pregnant, he instantly orders her to be burned for having played the harlot. 4 centuries afterward it fell to the lot of Moses to legislate on the Jewish morals, no doubt sadly corrupted by their sojourn in Egypt. His command is formal and emphatic. Do not prostitute thy daughter, lest the land fall to whoredom. There shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel. He was equally decided in his condemnation of worse practices, to which it would appear the Jews were much addicted. He laid penalties on uncleanness of every kind and on fornication, but it would appear that he rather confirmed than abrogated the customary right of a Jewish father to sell his daughter as a concubine. With the practical view of improving the physical condition of the race, Moses guarded, by elaborate laws, against improper and corrupt unions. Adultery and rape he punished with death. The bride was bound, under pain of death by stoning, to prove to the satisfaction not only of her husband but of the tribe that she had been chaste to the day of her marriage. A long list of relatives were specified among whom it was illegal to intermarry. Furthermore, Moses endeavored with marked zeal to check the progress of disease among both sexes. Whether the maladies mentioned in Leviticus were syphilitic in their nature, it were difficult to say. Modern medical science admits that, in hot climates, want of cleanliness and frequent amorous indulgence will generate phenomena similar to the issue so frequently mentioned by Moses. However this be, it is certain that both Jews and Jewesses were subject to diseases apparently similar to the common gonorrhea. that these diseases were infectious, and that Moses, in reiterated injunctions, forbade all sexual intercourse and almost all association with persons thus afflicted. So earnest was his desire to eradicate the evil from the people that he extended his prohibition to women during the period of their menstrual visitation. Having done this much for the Jews, Moses appears to have connived at the intercourse of their young men with foreign prostitutes. He took an Ethiopian concubine himself. Syrian women, Moabites, Midianites, and other neighbors of the Jews, many of them, as it appears, young and lovely, but with debauched and vicious principles, established themselves as prostitutes in the land of Israel. For many years, until the time of Solomon, they were excluded from Jerusalem and the large cities. Driven to the highways for refuge, they lived in booths and tents, where they combined the trade of a peddler with the calling of a harlot. Unlike Tamar, they did not veil the face. Reclining within the tent, with no more clothing than the heat of the climate suggested, these dissolute girls invited the complacence of passengers who stopped to refresh their thirst or replenish their wardrobe at their booth. So long as their practices violated no law of nature, the prudent legislator pursued a tolerant policy. Before long, however, abominable rites in honor of Moloch, Baal, or Belphegor were formally established by the strange women and their male accomplices. Moloch, whose disgusting exactions we find in Phoenicia and at Carthage also, demanded male worship. The belly of the god's statue was a furnace, in which a fierce fire was kindled and fed with animal sacrifice. Around it, the priests and their proselytes danced to the sound of music, sang wild songs, and debased themselves by practices of a disgusting and unnatural character. Nor was the worship of Baal less revolting. He too had his statues, in forms eminently calculated to excite the animal passions, and surrounded by cool groves in which the most shameless prostitution was carried on by all who would deposit an offering on the altars of the idol. It would even seem, from several passages in the Bible, that the participators in these infamies were not invariably human beings. Against such enormities, the wrath of Moses and his successors was aroused, on hygienic as well as moral and religious grounds. Participation in the rites of Moloch was punished with death. Aaron's grandson did not hesitate to commit a double homicide to mark the divine abhorrence of the daughters of Midian. And Moses himself, warned by the frightful progress of disease among the male Jews, struck at its roots by exterminating every female Midianite among his captives, save the virgins only. An express command forbade the establishment of groves near the Jewish temples, evidently on account of the convenience such shady retreats afforded to prostitutes. Yet on various occasions in the history of Israel, we find accounts of the destruction of such groves, and of the statues of the gods in whose honor human nature was defiled. Solomon, whose wisdom was singularly alloyed with sensuality, not only set the example of inordinate lust, keeping, it is said, 700 wives and 300 concubines, but repealed the wise restrictions of his predecessors in regard to prostitutes, allowing them to exercise their calling within the city of Jerusalem. They multiplied so fast that the prophets speak of them wandering on all the hills and prostituting themselves under every tree, and at a later date, they even invaded the temple and established their hideous rites in its courts. That noble edifice had become, in the time of Maccabees, a mere brothel plenum scortantium cum meretricibus. It is, however, apparent, notwithstanding the severe ordinances of the Jewish legislators, that prostitutes were a recognized class, laboring under no hopeless ban. Jephthah, the son of a prostitute, became none the less chief of Israel, and some commentators have contended that the retreat to which he condemned his daughter was simply the calling of her grandmother. Joshua's spies slept openly in the house of the harlot Rahab, whose service to Israel was faithfully requited by the amnesty granted to her family and the honorable residence allotted to her in Judea. Samson chose the house of a harlot to be his residence at Gaza. His fatal acquaintance with another harlot, Delilah, is the leading trait of his story. Even Solomon did not disdain to hear the rival wranglings of a pair of harlots and to adjudicate between them. Prostitution was in fact legally domiciled in Judea at a very early period, and never lost the foothold it had gained. Of the manner in which it was carried on, an idea may be formed from the very vivid picture in Proverbs. For at the window of my house I looked through my casement and beheld among the simple ones, I discerned among the youths, a young man void of understanding, passing through the streets near her, the strange woman's corner. And he went the way to her house, in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night. And behold, there met him a woman with the attire of a harlot, and subtile of heart. She is loud and stubborn. Her feet abide not in her house. Now she is without, now in the streets, and lieth in wait at every corner. So she caught him and kissed him, and with an impudent face said unto him, I have peace offerings with me. This day have I paid my vows. Therefore came I forth to meet thee, diligently to seek thy face, and I have found thee. I have decked my bed with coverings of tapestry, with carved works, with linen of Egypt. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until the morning, let us solace ourselves with loves. With her much fair speech she caused him to yield, with the flattering of her lips she forced him. He goeth after her straightway, as an ox goeth to the slaughter, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks. That prostitution continued to be practiced generally and openly until the destruction of the old Jewish nation. The language of the biblical prophets does not permit us to doubt. It may be questioned whether it ever assumed more revoltingly public forms in any other country. The Babylonish conquest must have changed the parts without altering the performance. At Babylon, the Jewish maidens, whose large, expressive eyes, voluptuous mouth, slender and graceful figure, with well-developed bust and limbs, were frequently the theme of ancient poets, peopled the houses of prostitution, and ministered to the lusts of the nobles. Nor even after the return to Jerusalem was the evil extirpated. It was to a prostitute that Christ uttered the memorable sentence, "Her sins are forgiven because she loved much." Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Egyptian courtesans. Before passing to the subject of prostitution in Greece, a glance at Egypt and those nations of Asia which seem to have preceded Greece in civilization may not be out of place. Egypt was famous for her courtesans before the time of Herodotus. Egyptian blood runs warm, girls are nubile at 10. Under the pharaohs, if ancient writers are to be believed, there existed a general laxity of moral principle, especially among young females. Their religion was only too suggestive. The deities Isis and Osiris were the types of the sexes. A statue of the latter, a male image made of gold, was carried by the maidens at festivals and worshipped by the whole people. Nor were the rites of Isis more modest. At the festival at Bubastes, says Herodotus, men and women go thither in boats on the Nile, and when the boats approach a city, they are run close to the shore. A frantic contest then begins between the women of the city and those in the boats, each abusing the other in the most opprobrious language, and the women in the boats conclude the performance by lascivious dances, in the most undisguised manner, in sight of the people, and to the sound of flutes and other musical instruments. There is little reason to doubt that the temples, like those of Baal, were houses of prostitution on an extensive scale. Herodotus remarks significantly that a law in Egypt forbade sexual intercourse within the walls of a temple, and exacted of both sexes that intercourse should be followed by ablution before the temple was entered. Where piety required such sacrifices, it is not surprising that public morals were loose. It was not considered wholly shameful for an Egyptian to make his living by the hire of his daughter's person, and a king is mentioned who resorted to this plan in order to discover a thief. Such was the astonishing appetite of the men, that young and beautiful women were never delivered to the embalmer until they had been dead some days, a miserable wretch having been detected in the act of defiling a recently deceased virgin. Of course, in such a society, there was no disgrace in being a prostitute. The city of Naucrates owed its wealth and fame to the beauty of its courtesans, whose reputation spread throughout Europe and was much celebrated in Greece. Rhodopes, a Thracian by birth, led the life of a prostitute in Egypt with such success that she not only bought her own freedom from the slave dealer who had taken her there on speculation, but, if the Egyptians are to be believed, built a pyramid with her savings. A large portion of her story is doubtless mythical, but enough remains to warrant the opinion that she was, though a prostitute, a wealthy and highly considered person. In Chaldea, too, religion at first connived at, and then commanded prostitution. Every Babylonian female was obliged by law to prostitute herself once in her life in the temple of the Chaldean Venus, whose name was Mylitta. Herodotus appears to have seen the park and grounds in which this singular sacrifice was made. They were constantly filled with women with strings bound round their hair. Once inside the place, no woman could leave it until she had paid her debt, and had deposited on the altar of the goddess the fee received from her lover. Some, who were plain, remained there as long as 3 years, but, as the grounds were always filled with a troop of voluptuaries in search of pleasure, the young, the beautiful, the high-born seldom needed to remain over a few minutes. This strange custom is mentioned by the prophet Baruch, who introduces one of the women reproaching her neighbor that she had not been deemed worthy of having her girdle of cord burst asunder by any man. Similar statements are made by Strabo and other ancient writers. At the time of Alexander, the demoralization had reached a climax. Babylonian banquets were scenes of unheard-of infamies. When the meal began, the women sat modestly enough in presence of their fathers and husbands, but as the wine went round, they lost all restraint, threw off one garment after another, and enacted scenes of glaring immodesty. And these were the ladies of the best families. The Mylitta of Chaldea became a start in Phoenicia, at Carthage, and in Syria. Nothing was changed but the name. The voluptuous rites were identical. In addition to the forced prostitution in the temples, however, the Phoenicians and most of their colonies maintained for many years the practice of requiring their maidens to bestow their favors on any strangers who visited the country. Commercial interest, no doubt, had some share in promoting so scandalous a custom. On the high shores of Phoenicia, as at Carthage and in the island of Cyprus, the traveler sailing past in his boat could see beautiful girls, arrayed in light garments, stretching inviting arms to him. Originally, the sum paid by the lover was offered to the goddess, but latterly the girls kept it, and it served to enhance their value in the matrimonial market. In some places, the girl was free if she chose to abandon her hair to the goddess, but Lucian notes that this was an uncommonly rare occurrence. Very similar were the customs of the Lydians and their successors in empire, the early Persians. Their Venus was named Mithra, in honor of whom festivals were given at which human nature was horribly outraged. Fathers and daughters, sons and mothers, husbands and wives sat together at the table, while voluptuous dances and music inflamed their senses, and when the wine had done its work, a promiscuous combat of sensuality began which lasted all night. Details of such scenes must be left to other works and veiled in a learned tongue.